The trouble when two autocratic systems engage in long-term warfare is that, honestly, the system's performance and their ability to actually achieve their goals often depends on the personality and strength of their leadership. And there can be problems in that. You see, Sweden achieved a great empire, a truly colossally great empire for its time and for its legitimate limitations. It really did achieve a great empire. In the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, it built up a really great empire. And it, in this period, starts off with arguably one of its greatest ever leaders. The trouble is, when you are leading such a system, you always need to have one eye on the future. And your future proofing has to be children. And it has to be a clear line of succession you've trained up and you've organised. And you cannot afford for there to be debuyment. You cannot afford for there to be division. You cannot afford for there to be weak links. You cannot afford for there to be fights and distaste and arguments over it. You have to make sure it is a solid succession plan. That is the reality of such a system. You can either have that, or you need to set up something which perpetuates that system. It's one of the really interesting things when we start looking at the British Constitution, and it's a strange place to start in this scenario, but please bear with me. This is also a similar period where Britain is really starting to develop its uncodified constitution to try and deal with the coming threats and how the role of ministers is going to be versus the role of monarchs. And you start to get a scenario where if the monarch's not strong, don't worry, as long as they have a strong minister, they're fine. The strong minister can take the lead, and Commons can take the lead. If the monarch's strong, the monarch can lead. If the minister's strong, the minister can lead. And as long as the nation has a strong leadership personality, it can keep going. You have a continuity. But that requires a sharing of power between two institutions, between a monarchy and a parliament, in a way which is often based more on precedent than it is on the letter and guidance of the law. Because by being fudgeable, it allows adaptation in circumstances which require it. Now the thing is, that is a classic fudge job. That is a complete and utter classic fudge job. And you are dealing with two countries in terms of Russia and Sweden which do not do fudge jobs. They don't. They do rules. It could be the close associations with Prussian aristocracy. It could be any number of reasons why they become such rule-focused organizations and such focused and straight-line structures. But they are. They don't do fudging. And that means they are even more dependent upon their leaders. The leader as in the Tsar, whether they are the Tsar of the Tsardom or the Emperor of Russia, or the King or Emperor of Sweden. What matters is they are strong. And unfortunately, they often aren't. And this sets a stage for the problems which happen. You see, we're talking about wars, the Great Northern War, the Russo-Swedish War of 1741 to 43, and the Russo-Swedish War of 1788 to 1790. And It's worth noting this is a coalition win. This really is. This is a Russian win. And this is a Swedish win on points. But it's kind of a Swedish win on points, like the Americans claim sometimes they won the War of 1812. It's a... You won it because, frankly, the other side didn't really want to do any more. They just couldn't be bothered at that point. They were fighting Napoleon. They were fighting others. They were more interesting to them than you were. They were. In terms of the Russo-Swedish War of 1788 to 1790, well, Catherine the Great really didn't feel like continuing on. She had other wars to go and fight. She didn't want more cold, difficult to control terrain. She didn't want to just paint red on the map. She wanted places which actually made her money. Finland wasn't going to make her money. Might be useful for some strategic depth, but it wasn't going to make her money. Sweden certainly wouldn't at this point. Later on, she might have had a different tune, but at this point, no. Now, we start off all this with Peter the Great, and he is a man of great vision. Great vision. He wants Russia to be something. He wants Russia to be the greatest power, the greatest empire in the world. He wants to rule the world. He is a ruler for whom the world is not enough, is not just a movie title. And he sets up these wonderful institutions. He sets up naval architecture schools and starts building a navy and all sorts of things he wants to build. But ultimately, the man who has this wonderful long-term vision really does have a wonderful long-term vision for a great Russia, is absolutely terrible when it comes to making some of the major political decisions he needs to make. And the fact that he dies when he does, or the issues he has when he dies, and then leads to the problems that come after him, it's entirely on him, but it's also on him that he starts a war with Sweden. And his choice isn't to start it because he's in a particularly good position. No, he chooses to start it because the new King of Sweden is very young. And then he finds out very quickly that new King of Sweden is a guy called King Charles XII, who is... well, to call him a savant of the martial arts would be to put it mildly. He's arguably one of the greatest generals who's ever lived. He's arguably also one of the generals who most consistently takes an army into a battle which is half the size of his opponent and wins. And there are various different arguments about how he does this, and some people go, well, he didn't fight in the lands, in the plains against the cavalry, and when that happened, they lost, and, well, he wasn't in charge of that battle because he was injured, but, and it carries on, and you sit there and go, look, he's on the throne for 21 years. And for a goodly chunk of that time, he's in this war. And for a chunk of that time, he's in exile, pretty much de facto, in the Ottoman Empire. Because to try and withdraw from Russia, that's where he ended up. The Ottoman Empire. And couldn't apparently get back to Sweden. I'm not really sure why. I know the Norwegian-Danish people are part of the coalition against him, and it's difficult to get around them. And various other powers are involved in the war, but to get from the Ottoman Empire to Sweden, in my book, at this point, would not have been particularly difficult, because I'd have probably aimed to go from the Ottoman Empire to an Italian city-state, from the Italian city-state up through Switzerland, maybe, into the German states, pushed my way through, with his good looks and his ability to pass off of languages, work my way through Prussia, and then get to Sweden. That would probably have worked for him. He'd have probably managed to pull it off. But he didn't. Because as good as he was at military, and as good as he was at politics when he was there, he fundamentally didn't understand the situation was very different when he wasn't. In fact, both these rulers have that same problem. Both of them have the problem that they don't understand what the world's going to be like when they're not there. This one never marries. And there's all sorts of ideas about why he didn't. I would say, honestly, he's young. He's worried about what it's going to cause in the political battles back home. And he thinks he's got time. He honestly thinks he's got time. He was 15 years old when he took the throne. He was 36 years old when he died. Younger than I am now. He thought he had time. And he thought he would be able to use that time. Honestly, he was stupid. Honestly, he should probably have got married when he was 18 and been very active with his wife to produce a lot of legitimate heirs as quickly as possible. In fact, honestly, there's a good argument he should have got married when he was 16 or 17. Should possibly have been the very first thing he did with his reign was get coronated and then get married. Because you need heirs. You need heirs, because who's going to succeed him is really not up to the task, and those who come with them are definitely not up to the task. His undoing was his march on Moscow. In 1706, he was at the zenith of his power. He had laid waste to everyone who was fighting against him. And then he decides he's going to do a march on Moscow. And initially, he has victory after victory of that. And then he's injured. And the battle has to be run by someone else. And it's lost. It's lost. And when he goes, well, the Swedish autocratic system really dies, and it descends into a parliamentary government which was as famous for its political infighting and squabbles and inability to make a decision as it was for its famous for its fashion show. It just is, yeah. Not a good example. But all this was going on while he was there. There were some naval battles. And some of them went Sweden's way, some of them didn't. But in them you will notice the Swedes do quite well. The thing about these naval battles, though, is that they all come after the zenith of Charles XII. After the zenith of Sweden. They'll come after the attack on Moscow. It's almost as if beforehand the Swedes just looked unstoppable. They looked invincible, and so no one was really trying to push them as much. But after that, after their balloon was burst, after their shield of invulnerability was burst, well, then they have problems. And this is an inconclusive battle, by all means. It's 30 ships, 21 ships of the line. versus 47 ships and 27 ships of the line. But the thing is, 2 of the Swedish vessels run aground, and the Danish lose 1 exploding. And literally, what's the action? What is the action? Well, they just line up and blast each other. After this battle, though, the Swedes did manage to sink and capture a Danish convoy of transport ships. It was supposed to assist the Russian force that was coming to supposed to go into Danzig, and that stopped the Russian invasion plans of Swedish territory. But as battles go, it's really not a great battle for either side. It just isn't. It's a battle which, frankly, they could have done without. Especially without the result of it, because an inconclusive result makes things worse. It really does make things worse. And then the next battle, well, again, it's inconclusive. Clarke leads to the Swedes versus the Danish, and, you know, he might claim to be really, really great, but this battle, he has 7 ships. The Danish-Norwegian fleet has 5 ships. He has an advantage. The battle lasts 2 hours of bombarding each other. His ships, he's got the Fredrika with 52 guns, the Kalmar Stetten with both 46 guns, the Wolberg, which may have 42 or 52, depending on how you're talking to it, and the Elsborg with 42, and the Charlotte 38, and Stenbock 36. The Danish on the North, Hans North, have the Fien with 52 guns, and none of the rest have more than 30. None of the rest have more than 30. There are 330 guns versus 158. Or, in simple terms, the Swedish force broadside of 165 is greater than the total guns carried by the Danish Norwegians. And yet, it's 44 dead on the Norwegian side. 44. It's inconclusive. You have a resounding firepower superiority, you have a ship superiority, you have larger ships, more 2-deckers. And large single decks, that they haven't. It just... The weather conditions weren't necessarily with them. There is that argument. That argument can be made. It is a battle which, frankly, both sides could have done better with. And it's also the fact that the best account of this mostly come from the Norwegians, and I do admit that. But when you read through the battle and you look at it, it's just... It's just mistake after mistake after mistake. North was forced to stand still, so anchored his ships in linear formation, and the Swedes were able to attack at their own choice. They could have massed at ends. They could have done anything they wanted. They don't. And North managed to rescue a convoy of 100 ships. It's just not a good example of leadership. You have this force, use it. You have the force, use it. Now, at the Battle of Hoogland, it's always important to be sure which one you're talking about, because there are multiple. It's one of those positions in the Baltic where if you want to go to certain places, you're going to have to go past Hoogland Island, which is in the Gulf of Finland, and there are regular fights there. At one point, there's a battle in 1705 between a single ship of the line of the Swedish Navy and 7 Russian galleys. The galleys lose. Badly. It was possibly their first time they took part in a battle in the Baltic Sea, and they get smacked around. They do. And that's the 1705 one. 8 years later, it is an inconclusive battle between the Swedish and the Imperial Russian Navy. This time it's 3 ships of the line on the Swedish side against 6 ships of the line on the Russian side, 5 frigates and 2 brigs. Now, we'd say indecisive because, well, whilst the Russians do lose a ship of the line, it does run aground, and even worse, you know, it's an important ship. The Viborg, which had 50 guns, which had, in this particular fleet is one of the larger war vessels. It's the Swedes withdraw. Swedes withdraw, and they cede the water to the Russians. So the Russians lose a ship, but they gain sea control. But there again, they do have the battle is between 6 ships of the line and 3 ships of the line, and, well, there's 5 frigates and 2 brigs also on the 6 ships of the line side. So they have, how do I put this politely? The outnumbering in terms of firepower is truly obscene, and it is worthwhile considering from this painting that most of these ships painted in here, I think, are the Russian ones. Considering literally out of the battle they provide 13 of the 16 ships at the battle. They kind of should win. They kind of should win the fight. They really should. And then we have the Battle of Gangut. Now, the Battle of Gangut is an interesting one. This is not just the name of the first class of Russian dreadnought battleships. It's also the first battle where they have an undisputed naval victory over the Swedes. Undisputable naval victory. And the Swedes have one vessel called which is a pram, which was a shallow drafted vessel, usually propelled using poles. Although this was a sailing pram, so it had some of that as a pole as well as sails. 6 galleys and some scary boats there, 2 roughly. So they have a total of 9 vessels at the battle. The Russians turn up with 98 galleys. That's what you can see all the time. They are the Russian galley fleet, all gathered round. And that little fighting bit at the top, that is the Swedes. Now, the Russians did play kind, okay? They realised that the Swedes only have 9, so we won't take all 98 in. We'll take in 23, and we'll feed in more if we need them. And it is... how do I put this? It is a battle which is colossal in terms of scale of the time, in terms of naval warfare on the Baltic. And basically it sets a tone for the Baltic. This is always going to be the Russians going for a sheer amount of firepower and mass and building up on the infrastructure industry which Peter the Great leaves them with. But the trouble is the Swedish leadership, especially by this point, is not the strength it once was. It's not able to do what it's not. It's even Charles XII has had to, by this point, due to his time in the Ottoman Empire, his time, even when he's got back to Sweden, he is rebuilding his position. He's rebuilding the control, and without the central authority of the monarch, the system in Sweden has digressed into a lot of petty squabbles, a lot of petty fights. The politics is very, very personal and very, very neurotic in a way. I have studied quite a few countries over the years. It's one of the interesting things, and honestly, I was doing this study at the same time. I was compiling this paper at the same time I was compiling my video on Yi Sun Sun, the Yi Sun Sin, the Korean admiral and the Joseon Kingdom, and the more I studied it, the more I was going, well, the Korean government is in this period is just about slightly more disorganized than the Swedish one, but at certain points it's far too close for any to be comfortable. Far too close. And the Korean court, the Joseon court, etc., is famous for it actually being common for, if you have a capable subordinate, you either manufacture some blackmail, or you get them thrown in jail, or you get them killed because they're a threat to your position. And it really doesn't breed a skilled operation of capable subordinates. Well, yeah, the Swedish one is not that much better. And admittedly, the kings prior to Charles XII haven't exactly facilitated that in terms of it being a better scenario, because they've enshrined a lot of power in their own hands. But again, the nobles do have a choice about how they run things as a group when they get there, and the Swedish ones seem to be particularly self-aggrandizing. All nobles have that issue as a rule, but the Swedes are just particularly strong on that front. Now, this is another battle where it turns out the Swedes are fairly heavily outnumbered. They're fighting a force of 8 ships of line and 4 frigates, with 4 ships of line and 2 frigates. But it wasn't supposed to be that way. No. When the admiral in charge, Wachtmeister, was sent out, Wachtmeister, he had got multiple instructions. He was to find a Russian squadron, which was some ships purchased, possibly built in Britain for Russia. There's a whole debate. And he was then to join up with the Gothenburg squadron. And the Gothenburg squadron was to sail down the Great Belt. However, Charles XII was used to running things a certain way on land, sure. He'd forgotten to tell the Admiralty in Stockholm what was supposed to be going on, so the Gothenburg squadron didn't arrive till too late. And by then, Wachtmeister was too far west of Furnham, and so they didn't manage to meet up. Which meant the Danish squadron, under Reval, manages to find him. And realistically, Wachtmeister squadrons is a strong squadron. It's got 2 third rates, 2 76-gun ships, and 2 56 and a 50 as core. Whereas the Danish Norwegian squadron has 1 third rate, and the rest are all 54s and 50s. So they're all 4th rates. However, it is a 2-to-1. And the battle ends with 5 Swedish ships captured, 1 ship scuttled, and 353 killed and over 1,600 captured. And the Danish lose nothing. Now, the thing is, the reason they get captured mostly of the Swedish squadron, and I will do this in the defense of the Swedish squadron, the reason they mostly get captured is that they run aground. They run aground. They are trying to do so many options that they, trying to do so many things, they run aground. In fog, with issues, and yeah, they're trying to maneuver, they're trying to organize themselves, they just all run aground. And get stranded. And get taken by the Danish. And it's one of those things of Sweden has started to lose its edge. Its edge has always been its organisation, its ability to bring its forces to bear, its ability to coordinate. And Charles XII had reached the apogee prior to that march on Moscow. That was when Sweden was at its most powerful. But by this point, he's fighting a rearguard action, and he is just trying to get everything back, because the march on Moscow had lost him so many capable subordinates, but also had meant he'd spent time away after suffering that loss, and then spent time away in the Ottoman Empire before he could get back. And the Sweden he returned to was not the Sweden he'd left. It really wasn't. And then we have the Battle of Rügen. And this is just an embarrassing battle, because you have 20 Swedish ships of the line, 2 frigates, versus 21 ships of the line and 4 frigates of the Danish Norwegians. And they basically turn up, bombard each other for a few hours, and then they move away, and because they do, the troop transports that the Danish fleet have been covering are able to proceed, and yeah. And they start taking territory from the Swedes. Thanks to those troops. Thanks to the Danish and Saxon troops who land on the island of Rügen and other parts. It's just... And they literally just turn up and bombard, and neither side can get advantage over each other. And Sweden actually loses less people in the fight than the Danish do. The Danish lose 612, the Swedes lose 478. Dead and wounded. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. If you can't sustain your fleet, if you can't keep it there, and if you can't give it the strength it needs to overcome, this is what happens. With that being said, though, unfortunately, this is the last major naval battle before Charles XII is gone, and he's succeeded by Ulrika Eleonora of Sweden, who is a very, very bad Swedish monarch when it comes to actually being able to run the country, and made only worse by the fact that she defers to her husband, who she apparently loves greatly, who is even worse than she is. Even worse. Hence she turns from queen to queen consort, because she makes her husband king. After pushing her way in to make herself queen, she then, 2 years later, makes her husband king, as part of a negotiation with the parliament. So, for the Swedish system at this point, this was definitely not the monarch you needed, or wanted, or desired in any way, shape, or form. There's no problem with her being female. She could have actually done it successfully as a female, probably, and after all, she did become queen, and she actually pushes hard to become queen. But then she becomes queen consort in 1720. And she literally became queen so that she could pretty much put her husband on the throne. And her husband is even worse. Honestly, if you consider Charles XII had not exactly been, in his latter years, the most involved ruler of Sweden, which had led to a lot of infighting between the nobles and various factions vying for power. And what I always find funny is they're always vying for control of, they think of the whole of the Swedish Empire, while not actually paying attention to that empire, and while it's being lost, and not realizing the thing that had kept it together was in many ways actually being able to make decisions and use resources quickly and efficiently. That's how it had an advantage over its locals counterparts. Ulrika Eleonora of Sweden is... what can I say about it? Not much nice, really. Look, she was a good soul. I'm not going to dispute that. She seems to have been quite a charitable person in so many ways. But as a ruler for Sweden, and as someone, as the person who then puts her husband pretty much on the throne after negotiations with Parliament, etc., with the the Swedish Parliaments and all these things. Yeah, she is really not the leader they needed. She really is not the leader they needed, and it's a sad thing for Sweden in that regard. She's actually supposed to be quite smart by all accounts, and quite charitable. So she could have been a very good leader if she'd actually had faith in herself and pushed herself through. But she's not that type of person. She really isn't. And unfortunately, the Battle of Osel Island between the Swedish Empire and the Tsar of Russia reflects this. Now, Russia was benefiting because Peter the Great was still in charge. They had a continuity of leadership, and Peter, for all his many, many failings, was actually fairly competent at running the Russian system. And had a vision. Not always a successful one, but he had a vision. This battle is bad because you have a key piece of territory. A key piece of territory. The island of Oland. And it is the second largest island in Sweden after Gotland. And it is a critical territory that they need to keep control of, and they want to keep control of. The Russians are trying to attack. The Russians are trying to do their operations against it. And the trouble is, all that's available to defend it is one 52-gun 4th-rate ship of the line, the Wachtmaster, the Karlskrona Wappen, a 30-gun frigate, and the Bernhardhaus, a 10-gun brigantine. And whilst, yes, the Russian vessels are 6 4th-rate ships of the line, and a, well, I would say, brig, 18 guns is sort of the best description of Talia. It's not quite a snow or a slope, so I'd say for its sailing style it's more of a brig, but honestly it's a bit hard to really push it through. Well, that's kind of a heavily outnumbered fight. And whilst the battle was supposed to last for hours, apparently was full of heavy fighting, the Russians take just 18 casualties. The Swedes take 451 killed, wounded, and captured. Now, when this video's come out, I think there will have been a discussion about the Battle of the Nile. It won't. The Saturday video won't have come out, but the Thursday video will be up there. And in that, I gave a full description of what happened at Battle of the Nile, where the French, Nelson managed to group his ships together to basically keep doubling up the French and work their way down the line. And that leads to some horrendous casualties. Absolutely horrendous casualty figures on the French side in comparison to the British side. reading the accounts of this battle, it's pretty darn obvious that's what happened here. That the Russians basically surrounded and fought. And the fact that the Commodore, Anton Johann Wrangel, didn't feel confident enough either to withdraw. Well, of course, it's critical Swedish territory. How can you withdraw? The Russian vessels are escorting galleys and transports. And yet, the thing is, realistically, he should have done, because you have just lost a ship of the line, you have lost a frigate, and you've lost another vessel for no chance to win. Yes, you have the 2 gunship of the line. They have 6. They have 6. Quite literally, the Russians are bringing 330 cannon. That's a broadside strength of roughly 165 to take on a force which has 92 cannon, or a broadside strength of 46. And realistically, what seems to have happened is the Swedes were surrounded, and they had, well, let's be honest, probably Natalia at wandering around adding extra fire, but they were probably facing 78 guns to the starboard of them, 78 guns to the port of them, and in the middle they were funded. And there's been some interesting discussions about in the comment section, but since I did live, on the fact that the Swedes always felt the Danes were better sailors than them, and they felt they would lose unless they had advantage. But they felt they were better sailors than the Russians. The Danes, there's a whole debate against, but honestly, they win quite often against the Danes as well. So that's a disappointment that they felt that way. But realistically, they should have not been put in this situation. They shouldn't have been. And then we have the Battle of Grängen. So depending on who you believe, either the Swedes lose 4 frigates fighting the Russians, or the Swedes have 4 frigates and a ship of the line, well, lose 4 frigates and have a ship of the line damaged fighting the Russians. Either way, what happens is a little port sort of anchorage space in the Allen Islands area, called Granhan, which, not to be confused with the one which is in the Stockholm archipelago. It's in the Allen Islands. The Russians seem to have been present in strength. They had 60 galleys and other boats, etc. And whilst normally frigates and capital ships would be definitely a very strong force to take them on, well, the trouble is the Swedes go into a space where they control it, where the Russians control the space. They're able to surround them. Now, there is a debate as to whether the ship of the line, the Pommern, the 4th rate, 52-gun ship of the line, actually enters into the battle. Depending on whether you read the Russian account or the Swedish account, it enters into the battle. But all 4 Swedish frigates are boarded. They are captured. And whilst the Russians lose, depending on your perspective, depending again on your Russian or Swedish accounts, between 100 killed and 230, 250 wounded, or 1,000 to 2,000 killed and wounded on 43 galleys, according to Swedish accounts, we're all fairly certain that the Swedes have 103 killed and 407 taken prisoner. There is a whole discussion as to its consequence, but let's be honest, it's a loss. It is a loss. And again, the Swedes keep throwing stuff away. They keep throwing stuff away. And things don't improve on the next leader, because that's Frederick I of Sweden, who was Prince Consort 1718 to 1720, and King 1720 to 1751. And if I was going to describe him in 4 words. Not what Sweden needed. He was powerless. He was successorless. He was weak and egotistical. And honestly, he was not what Sweden needed. Ulrika was his second wife. And well, let me put it this way. There is the strong suspicion that the reason the Swedish estates, their parliament, chose him was because he was believed to be weak, and he certainly was. There is also a whole discussion as to whether his brother-in-law, the Charles XII, had actually been killed by his aide, but it's unlikely. It is unlikely, mainly because that would have either required him or his aide to actually have enough strength to be able to do such a thing, and I don't think either did, from what I've read about them. I would be highly doubtful they could make a decision if they were surrounded by wet paper bags and they needed to get somewhere dry. I come from the UK. We've had our share of good monarchs, we've had our share of bad monarchs. We've had a constitutional monarchy now for so long it's almost de rigueur. In the nicest way, we've had a constitutional monarchy de facto since, well, a certain King Charles I lost his head. Which is always why it makes me laugh every time people, especially, this is usually certain, don't different way. Certain group of Americans are going on about the War for Independence and it's all about King George III's taxes. And you're going, no, British Parliament's taxes. There's no taxation without representation because you didn't have representation in the Parliament. George III is a nice figurehead for you to talk about and getting rid of the monarch. But realistically, the monarch in terms of King George V, had about as much power as a toaster. He was still, even in his madness, probably more used to Britain than King Frederick I of Sweden was. In fact, there are a lot of things which would be more useful to Sweden than King Frederick I. Because the trouble is, when you've been chosen because you're weak, and the system requires someone who's strong and decisive to actually run it, because otherwise the aristocracy and the rest of the system spends the whole time fighting each other and then wondering why they're losing wars, then it's a problem. There is a big problem. And he wasn't even able to use his passive power very well. He tried, admittedly, this is what shows his real weakness. He tries at the beginning of his career to be active and dynamic and, involved in things, but he quickly loses that. Within 2 years, he loses that will. And he doesn't even sign documents, he just has a stamp of his signature being used. And mostly he goes off and tries to have affairs and has children outside of wedlock. He is that kind of leader, really. That kind of leader. There again, there was an advantage for Sweden at this point in that they could afford to have a pretty terrible king for quite a long chunk of this, because they have a revolving door of their own internecine squabbles. Catherine I from 1725 to 1727. Peter II, 1727 to 1730. Then Anna comes in and manages to rule for a whole 10 years. 1730 to 40. And Ivan the Sixth, 1740 to 41. This is their succession of leadership. Now, Catherine I was Peter the Great's wife, and she tries her best. But realistically, this entire problem and Russian Tsar merry-go-round comes about because Peter didn't manage to live long enough to secure his heirs on the throne and make sure his heirs were adults, and there was a worthwhile line of succession working out. And he hadn't put enough thought realistically into what happens when he dies. he hadn't put enough thought into it. It's almost like if he thought about that, it was scary. It was something which was going to cause him trouble. So he doesn't. And ultimately, that causes Russia and Sweden to not have wars for quite a while, because between Frederick and this merry-go-round, there isn't much need for a war, because they're all too busy dealing with being internally useless. They really are. These are two nations which are both incredibly centralized nations, which require a very strong figure in the politics at the centre. Now, in Sweden's case, theoretically, that could have been one of the leaders of the estates, if they were strong enough to bend the estates to their will. But those don't really happen in this period. Someone who's so strong to be able to bind them together. And this is the interesting thing, because you have Sweden, which is trying to develop in many ways towards a constitutional monarchy. Yet they're not really producing the kind of system which gives them the electable leaders alternate to a monarch as that centralized figure. They know how to be a legislature. They're good at that. They're good at debating things. They're good at working through thorny issues. They are. Try and get them to make a decision. And in Russia, well, the trouble is with keep having a revolving door of leadership, is they keep having to reward a new set of favourites who've helped them get in that position. They really do. But what I will say this, if you have to pick between Catherine, Anna, and Ulrika, you'd probably want to go Catherine, because she's probably the best of the lot, but even Anna's better than Ulrika as a leader. Frankly, between Peter, Ivan, and Frederick, I'm not sure I'd want any of them. They're just not good examples of monarchs. Really not. Anyway, Shameless book plug time. Well, what do I do? What do I say? Well, thank you for watching the channel. I hope you'd like, share, and subscribe, and help the channel grow, and shamelessly plugging books. By the time this video does come out, I do hope that I have got through all the mortgage stuff on the house and have got a firm launch date in my schedule, even if I'm not announcing it, for the next book to come along. I will probably play that very, very close to my chest, and then suddenly there'll be a video up going, boom, it launches today, sort of thing. Knowing me, as it will be a Kindle Direct Publishing book. I'm going to be self-publishing, and mainly that's because I want to see what the options are out there. I've went the publish route with Pen and Sword. They're lovely people. I highly recommend them. They're lovely people to work with. But the money that you get, I'm not necessarily sure about it. I think they put in a lot of work. I really do. But that means I get a very small amount from each book. And I think if I go the self-publishing route and I produce something which is hopefully up to my standards and good quality, and it just won't come out if it isn't those things, what will the results be? What will I earn? What will be the money coming in? Because the thing is, academia, naval history, all these sort of things, they're going through a changing environment and a changing world. We've got to change the way we're funded. We've got to change the way we approach how we do our research. Myself, I know many people who are very successful with the grant model and working with the grant systems, and they're happy with them, and I can see why they are. But for people who aren't happy with the grant model and can't find a tenured post in a university for whatever reason. We all have our own reasons for doing them. I now live in Cornwall, and there aren't many universities in this area, but there again, I wasn't having much luck getting a permanent post when I lived closer to London. For various reasons. That's a Discord chat discussion of why, and happy to go into those details with academics who are wanting to understand more of why things are sometimes interesting. But it's a case of, okay, how am I going to do this? And I think if I can find a model which works and which pays for my research, even more than the YouTube is already doing, let's say if I can find direct publishing books, pays for that research and provides me with additional income, then I can consider cutting down on the consultancy work, or maybe even getting rid of it entirely and just devoting myself entirely to history and publishing books and doing YouTube videos and answering people's naval history questions and doing the research, because that's the stuff I'd love to do. I'd love to be doing that, but I can't afford to do that at the moment. But I have to work out a way to make it possible. I wish there was slightly more dreamer in my personality, and I'd make more of a leap before I'm secure. But I tend to make sure I have everything worked out, including a nice, safe exit route, before I do things. And yeah, that can lead to a level of caution. But thank you for all your support. Thank you for making all this possible, and I hope you're enjoying this channel, and I hope you're enjoying the videos. Anyway, Elizabeth, Empress of Russia, 1741 to 1762. Now, on the face of it, an empress who made the decision not to execute a single person during their reign should be a pretty cool person. And she's historically one of the most popular empresses in history, one of the most popular emperors in Russian history, one of the most popular monarchs in Russian history. She did massive amounts of construction projects and infrastructure building, and she opposed Prussians getting too involved in Russia. She is the last agnatic line of Romanovs. The agnatic line of Romanovs. And it's her nephew who is the one who was sentenced after her, created the Holstein-Gottorp-Romanov group. And she is also the second eldest daughter of Peter the Great. She lived through all the foibles that had come after him. And she would rule for 21 years. Hereabouts. She's December 1741 to January 1762, so maybe it's, say, closer to 20 years. And she's good. She is good. I'm not going to say she isn't. But I also would say that she is incredibly focused on internal politics in Russia and trying to stabilize Russia and trying to build up Russia. She's also got a lot of other issues. She has a lot of other issues, and kind of like an Elizabeth I in UK history, she spends a lot of her time trying to bring about what is basically an age of enlightenment in Russia. But the problems for that were that she allowed the nobles to gain dominance in local government and shorten terms of service to state. She founded the University of Moscow and helped that working out and created that to support things, and her court was splendid, but she has problems. She has problems. And she possibly gets married. We don't know. Realistically. She definitely doesn't have any children. But there again, she was born in 1709. And possibly gets married in 1742. Now, why does that matter? 33 years old. 33 years old. Will live to get to 53. 52, actually. She's dies on the 5th of January 1762, and she'd been born on the 29th of December 1709, so yeah, she was 52 when she died. I did bad maths in my head. I do apologise. And the thing is, she's not particularly old when she gets married. If she does. She's not particularly old when she becomes queen. She could have probably had some kids at some point, potentially, but she doesn't. And I think largely the reason she doesn't is because she's trying to stabilise everything. And she knows if she does get married She loses her freedom, suddenly there's a husband, suddenly there's children, and suddenly there's problems with her nephews. Suddenly there's problems in the family. Whilst they think they're going to inherit, there's no problems with them. They know they'll be taking over. They know they will come to power. And her mother had been Catherine the First, her father had been Peter the First. She knew the realities of power. She knew them, she understood them. She did take part in the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, but she didn't fight Sweden. But she had a reliable diplomat, XII of Sweden, managed to sort out quite a lot of the issues in the War of Austrian Succession, but that also led to the 7 Years' War. And her troops enjoyed a lot of victories, especially against Prussia. They briefly occupied Berlin. But unfortunately for her, Frederick the Great was still going just when she died. If she'd lasted a bit longer, she might have been able to hold him down a bit more and push him a bit further, but that didn't happen. But largely speaking, she causes a lot of issues for the country as a whole. Because her method of keeping peace was to give the nobles power to hang themselves. And actually what happens is they stagnate and do hang themselves slowly. It worked. It was a decision made at the time which seemed sensible, but honestly wasn't a good one. In Sweden we have Adolf Fredrik, King of Sweden, 1751 to 1771, and Peter III of Russia. Both of these gentlemen are equally useless. They are. I mean, honestly, Adolf Fredrik spends most of his time either trying to actively overthrow the government and the parliament so he can get back power, and then when he's frustrated, not doing anything. He doesn't know how to play the long game. I don't think he could ever play the long game if he tried. I honestly think he doesn't have the sense required to be a monarch. His son's an improvement. His son's very good. And he comes later. But Adolf Fredrik... Sweden was not benefiting from either good politicians or good monarchs at this point. They were in the doldrums with both. And Russia, well... There has been a lot of television programs which have done Peter quite a lot of benefit recently in terms of improving the impression of him. But he really is not as good as they portray. They humanize him a lot. They improve him a lot, and their quality of acting does help with these things, but Peter III is... he's an idiot, is the best way to describe him. He is an absolute idiot, and that does explain how he managed to stay on the throne literally from the 5th of January 1762 to the 9th of July 1762. It takes skill to manage to get to the Russian government and Russian nobility to be so organized that in 186 days they go from crowning you to coup d'etat-ing you. It's incredibly quick. And let's be honest, we're very certain that he didn't die of hemorrhoids. Now, I realise some have tried, and some, and not just in television, some have tried to get him out and try and point out that he tried to abolish the secret police, he managed to try to secularize church lands, and he has all these reforming ideas. But the thing is, he formed an alliance with Prussia, and other issues which made him deeply unpopular. And it wasn't necessarily his policies which were unpopular, because Catherine continues it after he falls. And at least he does some policies, unlike someone who just not there. But realistically, and I do say this in the nicest of ways, Peter was racing off, and not bringing anyone with him. Divine right of kings, divine rule only works as long as people are following you and supporting you. Otherwise, it's not so much divine right as you shouting into the wind. Catherine regrets this. Catherine managed to rule for 34 years. Catherine the Great deserves her title of Catherine the Great. She was rambunctious, but she was also politically savvy, smart, reformist. She was absolutely brutal when she needed to be, and completely and utterly doing her job of leader. She would make the ruthless decision if that was what was the situation required for. But she was also, in the same way and at the same time, completely committed to the cause of keeping Russia as a growing, powerful state. She understands politics, and she understands bringing people with her. And I think this is a point. We are talking about possibly the best ruler we have talked about in this entire video so far, and arguably the smartest one that will actually come up in this entire video. Also the one who probably has the greatest personal power over her followers and her nation. Without a shadow of doubt. She is probably the single most powerful person when it comes to claiming divine right of rule, divine right of kings, or queens, monarchs. And yet, she is also the one who is the greatest consensus builder. She builds consensus by playing factions off against each other shamelessly. But she builds consensus. She gets people behind her. And when people aren't behind her, she finds ways to change their positions so they find themselves behind her. Please note, it doesn't change her position. She finds ways to change their position. To change their interests so that they now align with hers. There are ways. She will find them. And probably the most powerful thing she did, which was something which the nobility welcomed because they didn't think it through, was she continued Peter's policy of abolishing compulsory military service for nobility. Now that sounds great. It means nobles don't have to serve anymore in the armed forces. We don't have to go and serve in the armed forces. It's great. But it also starts to weaken the link of the nobles with the armed forces. Because if there's no longer compulsory service, that means they're not all integrated. They've not all joined the armed forces. They're not all served with the armed forces. And that's a problem. It means the ones who have, the ones who are decide to join, or are invited to join, are probably going to be her hand-picked loyalists. Which means the military is going to be loyal to her. Which means if the nobles cause her trouble, well, in the end, lead settles many disputes. It does. Now, I would say there are some problems with her though, because if we look at the latter wars between Russia and Sweden, once again we have a scenario where the Russian experienced leader is presuming that the inexperienced younger Swedish leader doesn't know what they're doing. And the worst moments in her career, in her reign, arguably come at the hands of Gustav III, King 1771 to 1792. as you can see, he actually dies before her. He is his father's son, in that he has ambition. However, thankfully from his mother, he gets a healthy dose of patience and a far more acute sense of timing, as I presume they must have come from his mother, because they certainly couldn't come from his father. And the grit combined, that means he does achieve a lot more personal ability to organise his armed forces and organise his nation and push it through. And the trouble is, the Swedish, they kind of went halfway. Okay, you can move to a model whereby your executive power, your day-to-day management of the country, is moved to a legislative assembly and to a government, away from a monarch. You can do that, but then you need to make sure they actually are stable enough to make decisions. They need to be able to make decisions, because if they can't, they can survive against the presumed power of the monarch, and they can actually carry out operations and warfighting. The trouble is, the Swedes had all agreed on taking power away from the monarch. They hadn't agreed on how to exercise that power under the new model. I love them dearly. It's a fun thing to read about. But honestly, after a while, you get used to this. It's the fact that they are going to keep shooting themselves in the foot. Because they cannot agree. They cannot agree on how to do it. And again, it's alright to be egalitarian. In fact, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to pursue a model where voices can be heard. And voices should be heard. But, at a certain point, you have to stop listening to the voices, and you have to make a decision. And usually, depending upon the circumstance, it depends on how, and the context, affects when you have to stop listening to those voices. If you're planning a piece of legislation, you can go on a fairly reasonable amount of time and work it out. If you are deciding whether to make a deployment, or to make a deployment, or maybe even build a castle or a fleet, etc., and how to maneuver it, how to deploy it strategically, you probably don't have that much time, because usually the time you're going to spend making that decision is time the enemy gets to carry on acting. And that's the problem. That is the problem. And this leads to many interesting things in this last war. Now, the Russo-Swedish War of 1788 to 1790 is a rather interesting war in that Catherine the Great kind of keeps pushing around Gustav III, presuming he's a young king so she can win, and ends up precipitating a war which Gustav declares. Primarily initiated domestic political reasons, but there's also enough foreign policy issues going on that he needs to do it. And actually, he forms an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which is a traditional ally of Sweden. He failed, though, to get the support of Britain and the Netherlands and Prussia, which, if he'd managed to get support from, would have probably caused all sorts of issues. His initial plan to try and do a attack on St. Petersburg and cause a coup against the Catherine II didn't materialise, probably because sensibly quite a few people worked out A, St. Petersburg wasn't that badly defended at the time, and B, lots of people who'd be far better connected with Russia had tried to coup Catherine II and failed. There weren't much chance of the Swedish monarchy. In fact, honestly, she is still pretty popular. The war ends with conquests by both sides being returned. It also, though, involves Russia showing the greatness of the navy which Catherine has built up based on the foundations laid by Peter the Great, in terms of its advantages, but also the weaknesses of the navy. One of the first battles that really illustrates this is Hoagland, and Hoagland is great as a battle because its results are both sides claim they won. The losses on both sides are a ship of the line captured. The Russians have 4 ships put out of action at the end as well. Both sides lose roughly the same number of killed, wounded, and captured. Roughly the same. Not exactly the same, but roughly the same. And, well, the Swedes turn up with 15 ships of the line and 5 frigates and 6 light frigates. And the Russians have 17 ships of the line, 2 frigates and 5 light frigates. And you might think, well, hang on, they're pretty evenly matched force. But as I've already mentioned in this video, and as if you've watched my key ships on the Rosaltov, you'll know that there is a small problem brewing in the Swedish-Russian naval battles. And even when the Swedes do slightly better in terms of the artillery duel, in terms of the quality of their gunfire, which they always claim the accuracy was far better, the Swedes turn up with 4 70 gunships and 11 60 to 62 gunships. So they're all solidly a third-rate navy. In fact, honestly, you could be arguing some of them perhaps are even 4th rate, but we won't go quite that cruel. Technically, a 60 gun ship at this point is, to an extent, starting to get marginal. 64 is definitely 3rd-rate territory. 60, it depends on the guns you're carrying to an extent. By this period, by 1788, the ships are there is that starting that growth to sneak in, and that's what we'll be seeing when, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, by the time it gets to 1815, you're looking at the 2-deckers are 90-gun ships, and the 3-deckers are 120, 130-gun ships. That's starting to come in. The Russians, in comparison, they've brought the Roslotov, 100-gun 3-decker ship, one of many first rates they have either gotten into service or are bringing into service. 8 74s, solidly 3rd rates, and 8 66-gun ships. Might have noticed something here. The Russian battle line is a lot more heavily armed. Individual ships will out-firepower their Swedish counterparts, and whilst the Russians might think they're less capable, they are bringing to the fight near enough 1,500 guns to the rather closer to 1,200 guns of the Swedish. Technically, it's 1,460 minimum for the Russians, and it's 1,242 roughly for the Swedes, is what I would count, because the Russians are overgunning their ships, whereas the Swedes are having trouble, strangely enough for them, actually making sure they have enough cannon on them. That was not the only problem, though. There was also command issues, because the fleet's under command of, well, who we'll call Prince Charles, Duke of Sunderland. Now, this gentleman is later on Charles the 13th, or Charles II, depending on who you're talking to. And he takes over after Gustav IV, who was Gustav III's son. Charles is Gustav III's brother. And I would never believe that someone would be deliberately undermining their brother by being a terrible naval commander. But every single battle he gets involved in, he seems to do just enough that no one's going to personally critique his bravery or honor, but he never wins them. They're always confused. There's always issues. Honestly, it's just amazing. And then later on, of course, he does depose his own nephew and gets himself made king, with slightly more limited powers, but of course he does presume he can get those corrected over time. Sweden is not being well led at this point. It is, honestly, as I've said before, making Game of Thrones look like it's actual proper bureaucracy and organisation. the amount of plots, counterplots, and things going on. In converse terms, his counterpart at Oland is Samuel Grieg, who I've talked about before. Is a very interesting officer, again, Roslov video, and a very capable officer. And a very big juxtaposition to his counterpart in that he is most definitely trying to win hard. Trying to win very hard. And one of the things that I do really find interesting is, yes, there is definitely a disadvantage of the Swedes. But they are probably better sailors. They are more than likely the better sailors in this scenario than their Russian counterparts. And if they use their sailing ability, if they use the maneuverability of their hulls, their experience, their advantage, I think they could have, at this point still, potentially checked the mass of the Russian vessels. They could have done. But they didn't. They get a confused mess instead. They get a confused mess. And you get a scenario where the flagship ends up managing to find itself surrounded by enemy ships. And you go, how have you managed to let it get that far? And the reason I can say this is because there are battles where they do well, but what can I say? This next one, the Battle of Oland, again has Prince Charles, Duke of Sutherland in charge. Again, and this time he's against Vasily Chikagov, who also definitely wants to win. Definitely wants to win. And he had been an explorer who researched Svalbard and all sorts of interesting things. He was quite a competent naval officer. But this battle is interesting because both sides show up with 21 ships of the line. The Swedes have 9 large frigates and 4 light frigates in support. The Russians have 10 frigates. And it's considered a Russian victory, and it rightfully should be done. But the battles supposedly between these great big thundering battle wagons is 7 dead on the Swedish side and 16 wounded, and 32 dead on the Russian side and 187 wounded. And there are no ships captured. There are none. It's just a very simple result, where the Swedes end up withdrawing after this initial skirmish, let's be honest, to Karlskrona, and the Russians get control of the Baltic Sea, ceded to them. And that causes issues. That causes issues. Now, the thing is, there are lots of personnel in the Swedish fleet who are aimed at, Per Liljeholm, etc. One of the admirals is aimed at. But, they would point to the fact that the Russian ships greatly outmassed them. Greatly outmassed them. The Swedes have the Vladislav, which has 76 guns, the 19, which is 74. They have a whopping, and I do mean a whopping, 6 74s at this battle on a 76-gun ship. They're going in heavy. They have pretty much every number of guns you can have from 66 down to 60. 66s, 64s, 62s, and a 60 itself, in terms of their ships of the line. And yet the Russians have the Rostov, the Dvensky Oslov, and the Kinets Valoromia, all 300 guns. They have a 78, the Lezkiel, and the Kielon, the Mislav, the Polveskov, the Prince Gustav, the Sven Elena, the Sven Peter, the Yaroslav, all 74s, with the Lezkiel being a 78. And then the rest are 66s. In simple terms, every single ship that lines up with its counterpart from the Russian Navy is pretty much facing either a peer or a significantly more powerful opponent in this line of battle. A significantly more powerful opponent. And you can understand, but again, you have advantages, you have skilled sailors. It's one of those scenarios where I've done a video, when this comes out, it will be before, but the video, I've actually recorded it already, or at least sections of it already, on Admiral Duncan and the Battle of Camperdown. And when you look at how he leads his fleet, he wants victory. Both sides want victory, and they go for it. And the thing is, neither side really has a massive advantage over the other, but they managed to, the British managed to get an edge. Luck, wind, weather gauge. And yes, again here, Prince Charles does manoeuvre 3 days, looking for potential advantage. But honestly, there isn't much advantage. There isn't any advantage. And when you have thrown this option away, this fleet away, you don't have much advantage but to withdraw to Karlskrona. And the trouble is, for the Swedes, control the Baltic isn't a nicety, it's a must-have. And the lack of investment over recent years allows their officers the excuse of, we don't have necessary firepower. We are following orders. We are following orders strictly. When you look at the battle, well, when the rear guard, which is what Admiral Perleon is in charge of, is separated from the rest of the fleet, it didn't manage to rejoin due to repeatedly being ordered to do so. But let's be honest, that's not going to change things. They don't have the force to force this if they are going to play a straight battle. They have to start adapting. They have to start evolving. They have to start using the skills they have. And then you have things like the Battle of Svensksund. And this is a Russian victory. This is a Russian victory, but it is a Russian victory which doesn't necessarily help the Russians out. Now again, this is a Russian victory, but it's a Russian victory which is very nearly not a Russian victory. Why do I say it's very nearly not a Russian victory? Because at several points the Russians find themselves in trouble. If the Swedes managed to get a slightly earlier start in their blocking operation, in blockading off narrow passages, etc., they would have shut down the ability of the Russians to make ingresses dramatically. And the main advantage the Russians have is mass, again, and they are using that. They're deploying, maneuvering around, and basically it's like trying to keep water out. When you have a limited number of pegs to put in the holes. There's always more holes than you have pegs. And the other problem for the Swedes is really they are trying to rely on artillery and training and skill to make up for mass. And the thing is, that had traditionally been a very good advantage of them when they've got decisive leaders who are able to deploy their forces before the Russians have built up their mass. But the system that Sweden is now deploying itself under is not decisive. It doesn't make decisions quickly, and you can see that. You can see that in how they're operating and how they're working. And you can see that in the effects of it. But realistically for the Russians, and for their coastal fleet's operations, they are pushing the Swedes back, but they are not necessarily inflicting the losses they need to be inflicting. And the Swedes are able to do a very difficult withdrawal in front of the face of the enemy, and it's a withdrawal under action. They lose 3 of their archipelago frigates, 1 Hemne archipelago frigate and 3 Turner archipelago frigates, slightly big ones, a light frigate, a galley, half galley, as it's called, a schooner, and 9 gun soups and 30 transport auxiliary vessels. They lose roughly 1,500 personnel. And, they managed to get 500 of those Swedes, unable to evacuate Russian losses, were put in a field hospital. But for the Russians, their losses were not much off the Swedes. They really weren't. And whilst they recaptured all the units they lost, they hadn't really been able to deliver what was a decisive blow to the Swedish archipelago fleet. They'd inflicted a defeat, and some would classify it certainly as a decisive defeat, but not a decisive blow to the fleet as a whole. And the thing is, a large amount of the Swedish fleet has managed to get to Svartholm fortress and regroup, and that means they're going to be available for later operations. And that's a problem. That is a problem. But then we have the raid on Baldersport, and this is where you do have very decisive leadership. And it's provided by Rudolf Söderström, who takes 2 frigates and a landing party of probably 60, no more than 60 men, and manages to sack and destroy an entire garrison. Is forced to capitulate, 49 cannon disabled, and you know, it just is a absolutely massive raid, and it's very successful. It's very successful. The battle with the Russians, this raid, was done quickly, done decisively, and he was outnumbered 6-1 and succeeded. He shelled the fortress, forced it to surrender, then got 4,000 rubles in ransom for the city. He went a Viking, and he did well. It's quite scary when the Swedes let their inner Viking out. It really comes out. It really does. Catherine the Great felt it was a shameful surrender, and she believed there would soon be an uprising against Gustav III. Unfortunately, there wasn't. There was no. She was thought there was going to be uprisings and things against their opponents, and really, the naval war sort of calms down to an extent. It sort of calms down a bit for a while, but then you have, well, this in May, the Battle of Reval. Reval is another Russian victory, and it's 10 Russian ships of the line versus 22 Swedish ships of the line. And you're probably looking at it thinking, Alex, how could that be a Russian win? Well, it's absolutely an astonishing Russian win. It's an absolute amazing one. And if you've ever watched any of the videos I've done on the Battle of the Nile, etc., you'll know why. The Russian ships are anchored in line in a bay. And what the Swedes do is they sail down, and instead of grouping themselves up to concentrate on one end of the line and then slowly move forward. No, Prince Charles's excellent battle plan, and this is why I seriously think Prince Charles was gunning for the top seat from the whole way through. His excellent battle plan is to just keep sailing round in front of the Russians. So you would sail along line, exchanging fire in turn with each of the Russian ships. Now think about that when we talk about the order of battle, because the Russian order of battle in this thing and their front line included the Kiel Oland, 74, but also the Saratov of 100 guns, the Sverdlina, 74, the Prokhor, 66, the Mislav of 74, the Roslov of 100 guns, the Isav of 66, the Pronosov of 66, the Bolsov of 66, the Ozel of 74, the Venus of 44. That's their first line. They then have a second line of frigates behind that, and a third line of small vessels behind that you are attacking into. And the Swedish ships, well, they have the Vladislav, which has 74 guns, the Destrin, which then has 64, the Gotha Legion, 70, the Louis Rica, 70, and that's basically, you go through the list, and it's rather like that. And one of the Swedish ships even managed to run aground and burn itself. And then they're going, none of them should be exchanging a broadside with a first rate, let alone with 2 first rates in turn. What you do is you group up, you park up, you gang up on one end of the line, and you work your way down. You blast away till you've got an opening in line, and then you blast up both sides of the line. Or you just concentrate on one end and engage that until, once you've disintegrated that end, you then work your way up the line. You don't go sailing past, and his plan was literally to just keep sailing around in front of them, engaging them. It's not a plan which anyone sensible would do. No one in their right mind does this. It's basically, yes, let's sail in front of all the enemy's artillery. Because they are moored in position, and all they have to do is concentrate on firing their guns. They don't have to sail, they don't have to wear, you're just literally going to sail past them. They don't even have to target themselves, they just have to wait till you sail in front of them and open, go bang. It's the most absurd idea ever known to mankind. How anyone portrays this as being a sensible idea, I do not know. But he, of course, portrays this as being, I was brave and I sailed up to them and offered battle. No! You sailed in front of them while they took pot shots at you. And you even manoeuvred closer to make it better for them to aim. What were you on that day? A lot of very strong drugs? A lot of fine wine? I have no idea, but whatever it is, it must have been very, very hallucinogenic to think that this was a good idea under any circumstances. And the fact there are senior officers who go along with him just adds to my anger over this battle. Reval is probably one of the worst, if not the worst, battle in terms of battle plan and the conception of warfare in the entirety of the Age of Sail. There is no battle where I can think of a leader actively turning their ships into targets as well as this. You know what's even more fun? The fact is the Russian ships took very little damage because, due to the strong winds and inaccurate aiming is what they're classifying it, the Swedish shot mostly ricocheted past their targets. It's just... The one annoying thing is that the Swedish General Admiral's ship, the flagship, which did manage to get itself into trouble and did, potentially, it could have caused itself to get lost, managed to get into grape shot range of the Roslav and took massive damage from it. It's just... Solomon is actually... Prince Charles is actually directing the battle from aboard the frigate, the Ulla Thursson, beyond range of Russian artillery fire, while his ships are sailing in front of the enemy. He's off in safety, his flagship's getting beaten up, and he's not even aboard it. It's just... Yeah. Sweden is not being well served by their leadership at this point, by any stretch of the imagination. Any stretch of the imagination. And then we get to the Battle of Frederikshamn. And you're probably wondering why in the previous battle I didn't mention who the Russian leader was. Because it honestly didn't matter. Vasily Chikagov might have been in charge, but my poodle could have done as good a job. The senior fluffy research assistant could have done just as good as a job. Because all he needed to do was sit there and bark fire when the Swedish ships came nearby. Literally, they are coming up and presenting themselves to be killed. How nice. In a nice, orderly fashion. The Battle of Frederikshamn, well, that is a Swedish victory. And this time, you know how it wins? Well, there's someone on the Swedish side who actually does want to win in charge. It's called Gustav III. He comes out himself, and he's in charge of the Archipelago fleet. And he managed to inflict a fairly decent loss on the Russian coastal forces. He does, you know, it works well. The battle is, how do I put this? Not exactly a free-flowing or massive one. Basically, the Gustav uses the age-old trick of we approach them early in the morning before they're ready. And while they're trying to scramble to get ready, it then starts into a several-hour-long firefight as Russians come out in dribs and drabs and get smashed up by the overwhelming might of the Swedish Archipelago fleet. And the Swedish Archipelago fleet in this battle loses 1 gunneal and 60 dead or wounded. And the Russians lose well, the Russians lose a archipelago frigate which they captured off the Swedish, which was returned to the Swedish, the Sanaveria. They lost 25 other ships smaller than that sunk or captured, and roughly 270 dead, wounded, and captured. And it is a brutal battle, but the fact is the Russian ships were not as able to navigate in the shallow waters and weren't as able to use it as well. And say what you like about him, but Gustav III was a decisive leader in battle. And when he was there was no demurring. And also, he didn't have ideas like, I want my ships to get slaughtered by the Russians, so I'm going to sell them up nicely in turn. Seriously, Charles the frigating 13th, or the second, depending on who you are, I do it as I say, is, to me, his decisions, especially in commanding those battles, do flirt heavily with treason. And that might make me unpopular with some of my Swedish viewers. It might, but I just can't imagine a scenario whereby if a Royal Navy Admiral had gone home and said, well, I sat in a frigate and I had my ship sail in front of the enemy while they're firing, and take in turns to be engaged by their first-rate ships of the line instead of trying to outmass them, and that man would not have been hung. Look at what the Royal Navy did to Byng. There is no... even if he was a Prince of the Crown, even if he was a Royal Prince, if he'd come home and said that, he wouldn't have been around for long. It might have not been a court martial. It might have been a nasty accident. These things have happened. All I'll say is look up British princes and barrels of wine and see how many of them have managed to drown inside barrels of wine. It's almost an endemic. And yeah, there have been ways found. And then we have the Battle of Kronstadt. And at this point, if I had been Gustav III, I think I would have executed my brother or taken over command from him. But no, again, he's in charge. And again, the Russians achieve a victory. Some would claim it's a strategic victory. It's Admiral Alexander Kruze in charge of the Russian fleet, this time versus Duke Charles. The Russians turn up with 17 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and 8 rowing frigates. The Swedes turn up with 22 ships of the line, 8 frigates, and 4 light frigates. And light frigates, rowing frigates, are usually both will use oars to an extent to assist their move, and most of the time. And the thing is about this battle, and the really interesting thing about this battle, is that once again, Charles shows why he shouldn't be in charge of anything. Now, we could argue that it's just doing some light skirmishing, but on this occasion, you have a single Russian squadron. And there are other Russian squadrons coming to assist them, which is why Duke Charles chooses to withdraw once he learns the other Russian squadrons are coming. Officially. But the thing is, he has 22 ships. And again, whilst they are outgunned individually by their counterparts, and the Russians have only 17 ships of the line, Charles also has more frigates. 8 proper frigates. Which means his frigate force and his light frigates do technically outmass. And theoretically he's got more reinforcements coming from the coastal fleet sorting out to support him, being sent by his brother, his king. So, here is the thing. Theoretically, if the weather allows, and the weather does seem to be quite good at several points for them to consider actually fighting and blasting at each other, so it must have been good enough for manoeuvring, he could have tried to double up the Russian line. He's got enough ships to try and pull it off. It's got 22 ships line. Individually, not powerful enough. But if you're engaging both sides of an enemy ship, yes, that ship might be on its own more powerful than either ship which is engaging on both sides, but that's going to cause a lot of damage. It's going to really ricochet into it, and it's going to cause it to be overwhelmed quite quickly. And so what you normally do in this scenario is you start a rolling thing, where maybe you start off with 5 ships on the far, going on, dividing off, and 17, matching in on the other side, so they have to deal with 2 squadrons. How are they going to move and avoid them? And a squadron comes up from the rear. Or maybe it comes from the front, but usually you want it to try and come attack from a different angle, so that you can concentrate fire, and slowly you can have ships move across to that other squadron. You even up until eventually you've got forced the enemy down to roughly 11 ships, and you've got 11 on each side, and you're blasting away merrily. And yes, they might have some first rates, but if you're using your frigates and your light frigates properly, and they're maybe trying to get into boarding range or raking, which they shouldn't really do, but they can give it a go in this scenario, and especially if you've got ships coming out with troops aboard them, like the coastal ship, the archipelago fleet normally carries on them. Use them. Do boarding actions. Take some of those Russian first rates. I dare you. Imagine how useful they've been. But no. No. It's Duke Charles of Oland. It's Prince Charles. It's the future King Charles XIII. We're going to try nothing innovative. We're not even going to successfully defend our position. See, the thing is, some people go, well, he's in a difficult position because their ships are individually more powerful, and, he can't afford to lose the fleet, because then he loses control of the Baltic. But he surrenders control of the Baltic anyway. So strategically, the Russians get a strategic victory because they achieved the thing they wanted to. If he withdraws, they get it anyway. If he loses the fight, they get it anyway. So you have to be aggressive. You have to try and innovate, and you have to try and figure out ways to make your smaller ships outmatch your opponents. And let me give you a clue. You don't do that by sailing past them. You don't. Then we have the Battle of Bjorkosund. And this is a Swedish victory. It is a Swedish victory. And once again, it's the archipelago fleet bringing it to victory for the Swedes. But it's not just the Swedes who have commanders who realistically are a little bit stupid. Although in this case, there's limited options. The archipelago fleet has successfully managed to narrow off the options, so the only space the Russians can go down is Bjorkosund. And the trouble with going down Bjorkosund is that the Swedes are there. There are 42 of them, and they're gunboats, sort of sloops, sort of things, under Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Helmelsteiner, with Major Leonaka and Captain Scharf in charge of each of them commanding a division of 14. Each of the 3 commanding a division of 14, so 42 vessels in total. And it's beside the island of Castanari, and the Russians have to attack through. It's narrow, and basically at 2300 hours on July the 2nd, the Swedish vessels carry on fighting till 0400 hours, when they receive their orders to fall back to the main ships as they're planning a breakout in Viborg Bay. And, they held it. They were planning on holding it longer if they needed to, but the Russians had stopped coming because, they'd lost 400 men, a frigate, a Zubek, and other vessels, and lots of them had that major damage, and frankly, they couldn't get through properly. That then leads us to the Battle of Viborg. Now, Viborg Bay is another interesting battle, because technically it's a battle which you could argue that the Swedes lose because they are forced to withdraw. You can also argue it's a battle the Swedes win because they successfully withdraw. And again, it's under the command of Gustav III and Prince Karl. It's, Prince Karl, aka the Duke of Oland, who, amazingly, when Gustav III is around to watch him, can actually command decently. Again, this is another reason why I'm highly suspicious of his performance in previous battles. Because when he's got his brother actually there watching him, he lives up to his hype. This makes me suspicious of the Russo-Swedish leadership. The Russo leadership is interesting. The Swedish leadership is downright internecine fighting. Gustav takes direct control of basically the archipelago fleet, and Prince Charles has the battle fleet, for want of a better phrase. And they have roughly 22 ships of line and 12 frigates sitting in that, and they have roughly between 250 and 350 archipelago vessels, including various landing parties and troops. And they managed to push themselves out. Now, the Russian estimates are basically they don't lose a single vessel lost, but it's more likely they actually had a fair number of ships which were put out of action, because basically what the Swedes managed to do is A, limit the maneuver of the Russian fleets, and B, smash their way through one of the Russian squadrons. And whilst the Swedes do lose ships, they do, probably roughly 7, 2 lost sort of to damage after the battle. The fact is, you expect that in that kind of scenario, and you don't expect someone to make a breakout of this scale without having cracked their enemy line a bit, and probably smashed a bit of that as well. And it's a pretty simple plan of action, it really is. Now, a fire ship went first, and in the battle fleet which was under, the prince's command, was also Gustav III. He was on another of the ships, although he actually gets out and is rowed through the line, rowed through the fire, because that's hoped to protect him in some way and stop him being hurt, because no one's going to target a rowing boat in this fight. They're not. It's not what you do. And basically, by being rowed through the fire, it'll be nice and safe. And he then boarded another one of the ships of the line after they were through. But basically, the leading Swedish ships do take damage passing through the line and pushing the line. But they open a hole which lets all the archipelago fleet through, lets all their ships through. And that's important, because with the Swedish getting away, they actually maintain a fleet. And a fleet in being is incredibly important, because they managed to get forced to extent by someone managing to repeatedly lose control of the Baltic, and managed to allow the archipelago fleet, as well as the Baltic fleet, as well as their Baltic battle fleet, to get blockaded up. And this could very easily have turned into an annihilation of the Swedish forces. And it doesn't. And it doesn't because, they fight very, very hard. Very, very hard. There are multiple depictions of the battle, as you can see, and it is a bloody affair, but it's a breakout. And when we're talking about the forces involved, on the Swedish side, there were possibly as many as 40,000 personnel. On the Russian side, there's 21,000. When you've got that many people fighting each other, there's going to be some heavy casualties. And there are. One thing I'd also add is that Rudolf Cederström is there again. Gustav III's reliable commander from the raid on Baltiskpot. And honestly, I don't think he's there to help with Gustav III keeping an eye on his brother. Honestly, sure he's not, but the way the battle unfolds and the way the Swedes manage to push through and push out shows how well they can fight. Shows how well they can fight when they need to. And the thing is, you almost have an ongoing battle What do I mean by that? You see, this battle takes place on the 3rd of July in 1790. In terms of the Julian calendar, it's on June, but it's July in the Gregorian calendar. A few days later, less than a week later, takes place the Battle of Bjorkosund, which is another Swedish victory. And again, it's Gustav III in charge. Because the ships he's managed to get out, he's managed to pull into a place which he can use them for. And as he managed to escape, he's managed to secure himself. And with himself secured, when the Russians come to attack him, well, they lose a lot. They lose a lot. This is also probably the bloodiest battle of the war. Especially from the Russian perspective, because, well, the Swedes start off with 14,000 men and 275 ships. The Russians, 18,500 men and probably about the same number of ships, roughly. The Russians suffer 10,000 killed, wounded and captured, and between 50 and 80 ships sunk, destroyed or captured. The Swedes, between 6 to 700 killed and wounded, and 6 ships sunk or destroyed. That is a massive disparity. Again, Karl von Nassau is in charge. It's always good to have him around. Proving, once again, you can keep mucking up and still be promoted. But the thing is, for the Swedes, as this shows, it's a defensive battle. But the Russians are attacking into a place which is easily defended. And the main thing that happens is this position, this Borgia fleet, managed to get attacked strongly, reinforce, counterattack, and then manage to send ships round. And that maneuver round causes the Russians to think that others are withdrawing on their lines. They withdraw, which means the centre of the Russian line ends up entirely surrounded and being fired on by 3 sides. And they just start drifting into the Swedish line, completely smashed up. And this wouldn't have been possible, and the whole of if you're ever interested in studying amphibious warfare, literal warfare, look up the archipelago fleets. It really is illuminating and teaches you so much. And it's so applicable even to modern day. Especially to modern day, I would argue, because the thing is, they don't think necessarily of their ships as warships. They think of them as fighting platforms that they can move. And in some ways they use them as that. In other ways they use them as ships in a sort of traditional sense, but they think of them also as fighting platforms that can move, and they use them to transport guns. And they're not tied with, we need to keep the guns on the ships. No, if we can move them ashore, build a temporary shore position which is actually stronger than the ship, we'll do that, rather than risking the ship. And use the ship as our manoeuvre asset. They think things through very, very eloquently. And it's really interesting to think about how you could apply its lessons to modern warfare. And this is the final battle we're talking about in this particular video, because I find this whole series of battles, these whole series of wars that they have in the 18th century between Sweden and Russia, to be incredibly interesting because of all the things they managed to get up to and all the problems they create for themselves. And the importance of leadership. The fact is, at many points, the difference the Swedes have that really makes a difference when they are fighting successfully is the quality of their leadership. And the thing which makes them fall apart and useless is the quality of their leadership. And for the Russians, it's the same. The forces are, I would hate to say, equally matched, because they're not. The Russians always have the steamroller they can bring. They always can deploy the mass and the superior numbers. But the thing is, the skill set of the Swedes does even out some of that mass. So that all being said, I normally finish these videos on a question. And I hope this quite long video has been quite thought-provoking anyway, but I still have a question which I feel you would enjoy answering and enjoy thinking about. And that's this. The Russo-Swedish wars aren't really talked much about in the English literature world, the English-speaking historical world. They really aren't, not enough. But they're full of interesting lessons. And the question I have for you is this. Why, despite the fact that recently literal warfare was so important, not that long ago, the Americans, prior to their design focus, was a literal combat ship. We all know where it's ended up, but that was a literal combat ship. Why, when there was so much focus on literals, did not a huge focus on the archipelago fleets and the actions in the Baltic start popping up in literature? Why do you think that was? Because we're talking about the 1990s and 2000s. Talking about a period where there was a huge amount of discussion of these things going on, and yet it didn't happen. So I'd like your ideas for why, and what could be done to change that. What could be done? And what else have we got coming up? Well, when this video comes out, I think it's going to be after Admiral Duncan? Or is it before Admiral Duncan? After Admiral Duncan. So Pierre-André de Suffren's coming. Oh, that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed and take care.